Thank you so much, Dylan, and thanks, Michael, for inviting me to this wonderful place. You're so lucky to have something like the Science Gallery here in Dublin. There's nothing like it in the world. I think it's totally unique, a place that is, as you were talking earlier, nearly all science museums are designed to be for kids. And art museums, are usually for adults. Maybe kids are allowed sometimes. Why is that when children are always making art and science is supposed to be grown-up stuff? It's really quite a mystery. And this institution is starting to change that. And thanks so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be in Dublin and talk about this book and this topic. And happy Valentine's Day to everyone. So glad you're all taking your dates here and decided this topic is of interest. We all know that nature is full of life, is full of evolution of the fittest, survival of traits that are useful, that evolve from place to place. But, we often forget how much of evolution is actually about desire, and it's about sex, and it's about beauty, and it's about things that may be useless at first, like this amazing phenomenon, a bird with a tail like this. This is not a practical thing to carry around. This is, if evolution was either designed by someone who wanted to design practical, useful birds that fit into nature, or evolved on the basis of practical things being selected generation after generation, you would not get something like this, which is why Charles Darwin himself, in a letter to one of his colleagues, wrote, "The peacock's tail, there's something that really makes me sick." Didn't mean that he didn't like it, didn't mean he didn't think it was beautiful, but it meant that he couldn't explain it with the theory of natural selection, which he wrote about in Origin of Species, the idea, the process by which one species evolved into another over the many thousands of generations, because some new traits, random mutations happened and then turned out to be useful and practical and enabled more chances of survival. This couldn't have evolved by that alone, because it's so much of a burden if you think about practicality. It would be, not something useful to have. And so how could he explain this? Well, he worked in his second major book, Descent of Man, is all about sexual selection, where he put forward the idea that usually females, not always, females of the species will discern particular traits they just happen to like in their males. And they may not be useful at all. And over the generations, sometimes this can get totally out of hand, like this peacock here. This is what the girls wanted, And most birds are not like this. Most birds have balance, ornament against practicality. And this bird managed to get through. It's like a possibility out there in nature. Extreme sexual selection, wild, crazy stuff. Birds of paradise, like this. This is a blue bird of paradise. These birds were called birds of paradise because nobody believed they could really exist. Wherever they came from had to be paradise, so explorers brought them back. And how could such a thing exist? It's full of excessive stuff. He's got this weird tail. He's got this strange emblem like a moth or something on the back. There's blue feathers in display. He's dancing around. How can he even move with all these things in the forest? This is the same species, actually, but not displaying. And this is clearly something that evolved because for some reason other than practicality. And so Darwin's idea, which was, by the way, not very well accepted by a lot of people, even more than natural selection in a way, the idea of sexual selection, that females could have so much choice, so much role in picking things that seemed kind of absurd, that this is really how nature worked. A lot of people didn't like that idea. And this is what the birds look like, what they appear. But even more remarkable to me, and the very case that got me interested in writing this whole book, was finding something like this in the woods in Australia. I just came across this. I was looking for lyrebirds, trying to play my clarinet along with them. That's another story in Why Birds Sing. And I came across a ruined version of this, just a bunch of blue plastic garbage in the forest. And I asked this guide, Sid Curtis, I said, who would dump these blue things here? He goes, no human did that. It's a bird. I said, what are you talking about? He goes, the satin bowerbird collects blue things to decorate his bower. I go, what is it? Is that like his nest? It is not a nest, he said. It is a sculpture. It is a work of art made by the male bowerbirds for hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of years. These bowerbirds have been making these artworks to attract the attention of female bowerbirds. And this is one of the very few animals we know that actually makes art as part of its strategy to find a mate. And why have they really been collecting blue plastic straws for hundreds of thousands of years? No. Presumably, they were viewed blue flowers, blue anything, mostly blue flower petals. But these days, there's a lot more blue plastic than these flowers. And the thing about this bird is it must have blue. Whatever is blue, it will get. If you decide to keep them in a zoo, bowerbirds, they can't find anything blue, and they see some small little blue bird, like an indigo bunting or something, they will kill it, because they must have blue. They've evolved to need to make these artworks, and it means a lot to say this is not a nest, it's not something practical, it's a work of art. Here he is, and he goes in there, and he is admiring his blue creation. He's a little bit blue himself, so maybe he's intensifying his blueness by spreading it all around. But they're not that blue, And they do a whole kind of performance. And there is somewhat of a function for this bower in that the female actually goes in there like a seat and then watches the performance. He dances, he throws these leaves around, does this whole show. And the view often among bowerbird scientists was mostly that he'd have the loudest song, the biggest display, the bluest everything, the most, and carry on and do this big dance and jump all over the place. And the bigger it was, the louder it was, the more likely the females would like it. But it turned out everybody doing this research, they were all men. They were all male bowerbird scientists, and there was a female grad student. She said, I don't think that's what's happening. I think I'm watching these females, and when it gets to be too excessive, they run away or they back off, and that she thought that the actual aesthetic of these bowerbirds, what the females liked, was a balanced performance. It should be loud, but not too loud, dramatic, but not too dramatic. But none of the men studying this thought that, everything had to be most, more, biggest, and so she said, I'm going to study this, I'm going to invent the fembot bowerbird. This is a robot bowerbird. Pretty convincing. I think it's not made out of a real bird. It's like a vegan plastic, bowerbird with a remote control, and she can make it flinch. So she was able to control male behavior, you see, very useful, by taking those little knobs and making the female robot flinch a little bit, and the male would calm down just enough. And so she had some proof that the aesthetic of the bowerbird is not most, biggest, loudest, but has to be kind of under control. Pretty amazing project. Okay, this is another species. Vogelkopf's bowerbird builds a giant tent-like structure and carefully decorates it with pieces of dead, insect larvae, blue flowers. This is not arranged by the photographer. He did not set this up. This is what the birds do. And this is the most lavish. This is something the bird sets up. This is like contemporary art. This is an art installation. He decorates it with a very careful arrangement, and this is not a nest. It's not used for anything. It's just an artwork in the woods in New Guinea. Now, you could say, well, why don't we see this all over the world? Why aren't there other animals making artworks like this? Well, there are to some degree, but there aren't. Some people believe that there aren't any big predators in New Guinea and Australia, and that's why, for millions of years, this kind of behavior could evolve. It's like a peacock's tail. It's a runaway possibility, totally extreme behavior. That it's always possible, but usually practicality works against it. It doesn't happen. Here's another one. And these birds they raid each other. They're like musicians stealing each other's ideas, or artists raiding each other's studios. They come and steal things and they take them. I got to see Francis Bacon's studio today. It was somehow moved to Dublin. As a whole vast artwork. These are like the works of these birds. They come and steal each other's stuff. Like you run into someone's studio, I want that. I'm going to use that in my artwork. And so they compete somehow. And again, what makes it work is the females have a very finely developed aesthetic sense of this is right, this is what's best, this is the ideal sculpture. And, humans don't quite understand it. We don't know that there should be all this. This is the dung of some animal right in the middle here. Why? How do they decide? How do they know? But the aesthetic sense is very specific in these species. And this is the one animal, one group of creatures that suggests that, art can evolve, the need to make art. And the question is, do we describe that as if it's practical, or if it shows how evolution can be impractical? Most of the literature among scientists tries to explain how it's actually useful to do this, and that to build these things. This middle one, the golden bowerbird, looks like those giant towers in Malaysia, among the world's tallest buildings. The two towers of the bridge high up there comes from birds. A Christmas tree type thing, decorated with little bits of caterpillar shit, hanging from the edge. And how are they? This is how they're related. They evolved. There's a related sense. They evolved in different directions, to make these things. But is there any reason for it? I think that that's sort of the wrong way to look at it. That you really should show that evolution sometimes needs to produce things that are beautiful, and that aesthetic sense is something that nature offers. And it's one of the things going on in evolution. Here is a spotted bowerbird, a similar one, decorated with white things. But here is a sculpture by the American artist Patrick Doherty, who builds giant bowerbird-like shapes, And I asked him, he builds them all over the world. They're usually fairly temporary. They kind of decay afterwards. And I asked, how much did you know about bowerbirds when you started making this work? He goes, yeah, well, I knew about it, but, but I'm a human. There isn't just one way I have to make it. These bowerbirds don't really have a choice. You can't train them to like something else. Or nobody's tried. Maybe you could. But it's clear that another thing that interests me in this book, which I'm only say a little bit about now, is that because of what human art has become in the last decades, we now appreciate many more strange things as being art than we did before. Like this thing here is presented as a piece of contemporary art, and not like a weird house from the distant past, which you might have seen as before something practical. This is an artwork. It's to be enjoyed and admired. And so I'm thinking that today we accept so many possible things as art that this is a good thing in terms of seeing art in nature. We may see many more examples of artistic behavior in the animal world. Still, there's this peacock's tail, and still you'll find, science likes to explain this away. They want it to be adaptation. The mainstream view in biology, actually, is sexual selection is really part of natural selection. All this stuff about beauty is not interesting in itself. It's interesting because it helps someone get a mate and procreate the species. So it is indeed practical. It is natural selection. And this peacock with his giant tail is actually the healthiest one. He's actually the one that you should choose as your mate, because he's also the healthiest one, even though he has this useless, beautiful thing. What matters is he's strong and healthy and will give you the best offspring. And so the mainstream view, if you read in biology textbooks, will be that beauty doesn't matter except in terms of procreating the species. But I say that misses the point. You're ignoring this beautiful tail. You're ignoring the beauty, the shape, and the form of this thing. And I go on in the book to talk about, could anything have evolved? Could the peacock's tail be any shape, any pattern? Or are there certain laws in nature that determine what possibilities are among those we choose from? But, being a musician, the way I got into this, in addition to the bowerbird, is thinking about certain similarities between extreme animal music. This example of a nightingale and humpback whale. These are two animals that sing songs far excessive and very difficult to explain. We have no idea why the nightingale needs to sing for hours and hours at night. It's incredibly beautiful. Is it beautiful to the nightingales? Yes. It's a form of aesthetic, musical, sexual selection. In the case of whales, humpback whales can sing for 24 hours, this long, complex song. Only the males are singing. So science wants to believe it's to attract the attentions of females. They do it during mating season. However, no one has ever seen a female whale show any interest in this. People have been listening for 40, 50 years since this was discovered. They've never seen the female whales seem to care. Only the other males seem to care. And even then, often they ignore each other. But when they pay attention, this is what happens. One is singing over here. The others are a little bit distance away. One swims close to the singer, and they stop. They're silent, and they swim together in silence for several minutes, and then they separate and start singing again. No aggression, no violence. And then the other thing about these whales is they change their songs from year to year. They evolve it together. But they all seem to be singing the same song, but they kind of evolve it together. And we have no idea why they need to do that. Most birds don't do that. Nightingales change their song, but they compete more. There's more of a sense of competition. Each species has its own aesthetic behavior. They have own ideas of what beauty is. Somebody was looking at this picture in the book and said, these things look totally different. Why do you even say they're similar? This is a bad picture. And it kind of is, but it just shows that there's a sound, and these graphs sort of, they're like scientific computer printed out musical notation. They show, you can learn to read them and sing along. Like it'll go like, do you see that little arrow there? Do you get the arrow? You have the arrow, yeah. So it's like boop, 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 shoot, boop, shoot, boop, shoot, boop, 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 boop. And then boop, 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 shoot, boom, 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 so it's like a score for things that don't have notes. And the whale is like at a different scale. It's spread out of time. You see, the first one was just like 9 seconds, and this is like a whole minute. And the whale is going like, and then but the kind of level of structural complexity is kind of similar, but I don't think it shows the idea enough. And so what I'm going to do is show you a dynamic recording of the whale at its own speed, then sped up to nightingale speed, and the nightingale then slowed down. And this is, and I'm going to play along, because as a musician, I'd rather play along with these sounds. I've gone out to play with birds and whales, and that's some other books, but I thought I'd just demonstrate that to you live, so you could just get kind of confused and hear it all happening and see what you think. And again, there's this graph, which you can easily learn to read and make on your computers. When people started studying this, it took them about 4 hours to make a sonogram of 8 seconds of music, 4 hours of time, if not more. And you had to ink them in by hand. Now your computer can just print it out with like free software. And so you can learn to read these things. So you're going to watch it go by, and you'll hear the whale turn into the nightingale turn into the whale. And I'll try and musically join in here. And I won't say any more about it, and then we'll have our conversation. So here we go. So the whale, the humpback whale, please come up, and and the nightingale, totally unrelated animals, far away on the tree of evolution. And why do these songs have some similarity, some aesthetic relatedness? That's, one of the secrets of nature, I think, is worth looking into. What kind of aesthetic parallels exist throughout the whole thing? So that's something that's sent me on this whole quest. And thanks so much for hearing an introduction to it.
I came
You go here, yeah. This one?
Yeah, you sit here.
You weren't supposed to be the whale, right? Yeah. Right.
Humpback whale and nightingale, come on up.
Right, come on.
I'll just remind everyone, as we said at the start, if anyone wants to join in at any point, just knock your hand up. I suppose, David, thank you for that. We might start by what you finished with there, talking about that. Mm-hmm. And what struck me listening to that is there, do you see a difference between what you were doing, playing your clarinet, and what had been recorded, that it was the original intention of the whale and what the whale was doing? Do those two things have different functions in what they are?
Well, I do think whales and nightingales are both making music. That to understand these long, kind of structured vocalizations they do, they're more like music than language, because they're repeating the same things over and over again, and they have to perform them just the right way, or they do not succeed in attracting any attention. And there's really an aesthetic sense. There's a right way for these songs to work and a wrong way. And if you try and decode the information that's in this song, you don't find that much. It's like a piece of music. The same thing repeated, and then this is switched, and this is switched. Most people don't believe it's standing for anything else but itself. It's like a music. It's about the performance, with a beginning and a middle and end and a certain right way to do it. But that being said, they are not trying to communicate from one species to another. But humpback whales are always looking for new sounds. They're evolving their songs. So when I played live with humpback whales, broadcasting the clarinet sound underwater through an underwater speaker and listening with headphones, sometimes you hear the whales change what they're doing because they're interested in new sounds. Nightingales maybe also, but they compete with new sounds. They kind of... we know more about how they learn. Then they're more likely to pick something out of their existing repertoire. But whales, will imitate things you're doing. And as I said, we don't really know what it's all about because it's so hard to study what's happening underwater. We know
where
it's
do you
complex.
come into that? With that,
I'm messing them up. It's against the law. You can go to jail for playing music with whales. You can't harass marine mammals because we don't know enough about them. So there are actually whale police in Hawaii. They'll come around in these boats and say, well, what are you doing? You don't have any speakers, do you? Things like this. Nobody's come after me. But I know very specifically it's against the law. So because we don't know enough about these animals, I could mess up their whole communication system. However, I naively perhaps think that they're actually more, that they could handle it. And I'm going to stop, and I probably won't upset them that much. And there's such constant ship noise underwater and sonar experiments and seismic tests that clarinet sounds at very low wattage is really nothing compared to what they have to usually deal with. So I don't think that's... I think they're really interested in sound, all these animals that listen. They're kind of playful. They try all sorts of things out.
And what do you think is the human interest then in that, in our interaction, in trying to interact? Is it an interaction trying to go... Are you trying to interact beyond our species or to see how that's possible, or are you making a point to us as people by looking at that?
I think you make... music becomes wider if you welcome in the sounds of other creatures on this planet. If you recognize there's art being made by animals, then the world becomes a whole richer place. And if you can learn what it is they like and how it connects to what we like, it just expands the nature of what music can be. It's just really fascinating. Some people have pointed out you start making this interspecies music. Who's going to like it? There are no creatures who are in between whales and birds and humans. Actually, I forgot to show this final picture I saw an artwork in London. Someone had picked up on the same story and drawn on the wall a giant mural of a half bird, half whale, making this sound that's sort of in between. And so there's no such creature, but we humans are interested in everything, and the more we appreciate what's going on in nature, the better we take care of our planet and the more we understand.
And Aoife, how much do you think we need to understand, and how much do we need to look into these things? Do you think do you think it can demystify these things, and is that a good thing?
Somebody should be, was this for you? Or
Yeah.
Somebody should, it's okay to try and analyze it and figure it out. But I find I'd rather make the music and try things out. I end up, I'm working with these scientists on these issues, but I don't really like doing the quantifying part myself. I feel that I'm not worried about the mystery going away because it gets so mysterious. Because so far you try and figure out what's the aesthetic of Nightingale songs. Nobody can figure it out. It gets too convoluted. And yet it's another human quest that all these things are. We have so many different ways of learning about the world. We can use, in the bird book in particular, I talk about science understanding birdsong, musicians using birdsong, but before both of them were actually poets. Poetry was way ahead of music and ahead of science in taking birdsong seriously. So many English language poets in the beginning of in the Romantic era were obsessed with nightingales, and you had at least one who actually listened to what the birds were doing, John Clare, and he really took their sounds and worked them into his poem with real knowledge of what was going on. He was able to use these rhythms and sounds because poetry could accept it, whereas music didn't know what to do with it, and science could not take this stuff seriously until they could record it, until they had tape recording. Poetry was way ahead of this.
So when I was reading the book, right, I was convinced that you were going to dislike me when you met me, just for the very fact of being a scientist, because I thought there was this, as I was reading it, of course, when I met you, I thought it was completely different, but...
He did introduce you as a whale, so...
Pardon?
Right.
What? You did introduce me that way, yeah. Right. No, but, so I thought there was this undertone of, so there was you talk about things like precise, kind of the increasingly precise scientific approach, and it kind of felt like you were kind of saying it's too precise, and I thought there was a few times when you were kind of saying... that the scientific approach is, I suppose, cold as well for that reason, and that you maybe thought that it could. I think there's one place where you literally say it could explain away the beauty, and so this idea then that the scientific approach actually destroys the beauty. I suppose that's not one that I go along with, because I don't know if you ever heard this from Richard Feynman. He had this very long interview, which is a lovely interview for Horizon on BBC, and it talked about one thing. They asked him, what about the beauty of a flower? You as a scientist, can you see the beauty of a flower? And in his wonderful Brooklyn accent, he was saying, well, yes, of course I see the beauty of a flower. I mean, maybe I'm not as sophisticated as an artist, but that beauty is still available to me. But I can go beyond that, and I can think about how the flower has evolved to attract the insects to pollinate it. I can think of at the cellular level what's going on there and how that's evolved. And so I suppose, it adds, it doesn't subtract. And I suppose I thought you might have felt a little resistant towards scientific approach. Is that fair?
I think that I tried to avoid that direction. I think in the bird book I'm more hostile to scientists, and I tried to get less antagonistic, and especially in this I'm talking about a whole strand of science coming from Darwin, trying to investigate these things, and then I wonder why it became less popular. For 100 years there was very little biology on sexual selection, and I present this idea that one of the reasons is that people kind of made it really wild, and first you had Ernst Haeckel, who was really an artist-scientist hybrid, who did these wonderful illustrations and paintings of the vast diversity of natural selection, mostly in form and pattern, not as much on sexual selection. But then he had a disciple who was a novelist at first, Wilhelm Bulsche, this guy who's very popular at the beginning of the 20th century, almost forgotten today, but he wrote this incredible book, Love, Life in Nature, which sounds like an X-rated David Attenborough script, all about animals and sex, and he's going on and on about this. I believe that scientists read this and they wanted to stay away because it was too much. And it made it all sort of exciting and sort of delicious and unscientific, just telling stories about animals and love. It's really a great book. You can find copies.
So it's kind of social conservatism.
I think
bleeding over into scientific.
I think scientists already had enough problems with these ideas of evolution. They were seen as threatening all of society, and now if it was being so kind of over the top, we're going to stay away from that topic until
and you suggested
we had,
also kind of a misogynistic thing, that it was all men. The field was dominated by men, and perhaps the idea that women could have been so powerful, the female of the species could be so powerful.
Exactly. There's a whole. I mean, there's whole things in birdsong scientists where you can trace the age of the scientists and what they say. Like, about the older males are more successful. These bird species, they're obviously more experienced. They know more songs. These are the ones to mate with. Certain species are overemphasized because it turns out that they have, like, the louder the song, the more mating success. But it's only a few species where that works, and almost all of them it doesn't work. So,
where do you see that sexual selection? Where does that? What is the relation between that now and natural selection with how it's evolved? You talked about the idea of it as utility, but said you prefer to take a different route. But where do we then position sexual that aspect of it, selection? Now, looking especially, has it taken over entirely from natural selection? You
mean with humans? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think so. Humans are tough because we have a society. We can change the rules. We can decide things. We're not. We're influenced by all of these ideas about evolution and biology, but we can specifically do something different. Because of how human society works, and we use the metaphors from biology to explain our society, which is, we have social Darwinism. Only the fit survive. We don't have to help those that are struggling. And this somehow comes from science, but it's actually just choosing to use this idea from science. And we're kind of taught, well, that's the limited sense. And I think we often look for metaphors from biology to apply for human society, but you can actually do things differently. But there's some species where only one male gets to mate with all the females, and in humans it doesn't work that way. There's some species of whale where they're only one in the group is going to succeed at mating, and in others it's not the case. They don't have such level of competition.
Well, we could actually get a read of the room and see how many people that plays out for here.
You could see, and I think that, we always want to use science. We're always looking for something relevant to our own lives, and so we use these different techniques to justify the way things are with statistics and facts and data. But, someone can say, I don't want to do that. I don't care if 80% of the people like this. I'm going to like something else.
Which the statistics, facts, and data are really useful a lot of the time for making decisions.
Very much
Maybe
so,
not for making a decision of,
right.
Who to fall in love with. Okay, so that's a special case. But there are, I think there's not enough appreciation of the value of statistics and facts and data for decision making in general. Like sometimes our instincts do mislead us. Something that it can be with choices in terms of medicine or vaccination or strategies even kind of industrial or agricultural strategies in a country. You need to make a decision, and I think statistics, facts, and data are the best thing to fall back on.
Yeah, and they're essential
instinct.
for science to determine whether something is likely. You have to have a lot of data to figure things out, that's why it's easier to make music with whales than figure out what they're actually doing. You can have one encounter where the clarinet and whale, something happens together, and oh look, it's happened. But most of the time it doesn't work, and so it's hard to prove what's actually going on. But you can artistically do something interesting much faster than scientifically conclude what's going on with creatures that live underwater and things like this. But it goes back to there was a whole dispute between Ruskin and Darwin about flowers. Ruskin didn't like this natural selection thing about flowers and how they work, and he wrote this book Proserpina, where it's all about roadside flowers. If Mr. Darwin would just sit by the side of the road and draw and see how beautiful these things are, he would know that his whole approach is so misguided, understanding what flowers are for. Which, of course, I don't think it is misguided, but you can see how that somebody who saw beauty everywhere and then was presented with this idea everything's practical would be hurt by that and feel like it wasn't explaining everything. And it took Ernst Haeckel, who was an artist, to kind of draw the beauty of evolution. He sent Darwin these paintings. He goes, look, I'm going to become your biggest fan. I'm going to spread your ideas all over the continent with art. And Darwin said, oh, this stuff's amazing. And I think Haeckel did this coffee table book, Art Forms in Nature. It was all over Europe in the 1880s, 1890s. And people really saw that evolution meant beauty, beautiful things connected.
But someone like Ruskin didn't necessarily see beauty everywhere because, there was a lot of things which he totally disliked and said that's rubbish. And that plays into the whole idea of taste. And how taste can change over time. If you look at the things that we consider beautiful now, I like the form of the batten press concrete, in modernist architecture. If you showed that to Ruskin, I'm sure he'd he'd be appalled at so that idea of beauty not being absolute. What does that mean for all of this?
Well, I think these animals have more of a set sense. They know what's beautiful. They're more sure of themselves, They know the song that is right. And it's been that way for millions of years. I mean, whales are changing their songs, humpback whales. So they're testing out new ideas. But, so you hear a song of a nightingale, you hear a certainty and a kind of rightness and conviction that can often be lacking in human aesthetics because we don't know anymore. And especially in art, I don't know if you feel this way as an art historian, that we're taught in art history not to talk about the beautiful anymore, that this is some antiquated idea that something can be beautiful as opposed to something else. Anything might work, right? Do you think that's what's going on?
Well, I suppose one of the things which does come up in it is this whole idea, the whole basis of these objects that we look at, and the idea of beautiful aesthetic things has, in a way, become outdated because what art can be is often an idea. Many artists that have kind of done, Michael Craig Martin, a great Irish artist, did this glass of water on a glass shelf, and he said it's an oak tree because I say it is, and that it's the artist because he says it is, and because there's a willingness on our part to go along with that. The idea is what is the thing.
Yeah, then that idea in my book, I talk about how. One biologist, Richard Prum, professor at Yale, he's taken that idea about art. He's taken the idea of art coming from Duchamp and Arthur Danto, philosophers, saying that, something is an artwork if there's a community of people who says it is. And Prum says, perfect, that's how nature works, only biologists don't see it that way. Something is beautiful if you have a species that likes it. Like, a turkey has these wattles hanging, they look kind of ugly, but the turkeys like it, so it's art, it's evolved art, it's aesthetic. And we should look into that as scientists, and he feels that most of his field says, no, we must look at what's practical about all these appearances of the turkey.
But can you really call it art if it's not a conscious, the turkey just grows like that.
He says,
so
yeah.
Is my hair art if it's nice, if... You know what I mean? It's like
it looks beautiful. I love what you've done with it.
Thanks.
Right.
But you see
the
what I mean?
The dress is perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, right. Even better than the TV dress this morning.
Thanks.
Right, yeah.
That's a way of dodging the question. But
Richard Prum thinks it is.
Prum
thinks it is. I'm not so sure. There's some questions in the audience.
Yeah, we'll take some questions there. Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was really good and well played as well. I just wanted to ask, do you think that in the way that we're conditioned to like art, and particularly music, with things like tonality and cadential progression and regular rhythms, things like that, do you think that stops us appreciating whale song or, animal music in that way?
I think that today we are open to so many different kinds of sounds as music that really people are more likely to take the sounds of animals musically seriously today, because actually, although a lot of music might have a regular beat and tonality, a lot of music is strange noises put together in all kinds of odd ways, and we're more used to those sounds now than ever before.
Michael John.
I was just wondering, in the same way that these animals are clearly artists, is there an opportunity for animals to be trained to be art critics or curators?
But are they artists? I mean, how are they qualified as artists?
Here.
Well, I'm just wondering,
the females are art critics,
yeah,
right? They're
exactly.
really ruthless art critics.
Yeah.
Because if it's not good enough, they're just...
Could we delegate a lot of this work to certain kinds of bowerbirds or trained animals?
Well, they'll never pick
humans,
Duchamp's piss pot, right?
You never know. But I mean, yes, the whole idea of this sexual selection thing is that the females in most of these cases would be the critics, and that's where the aesthetic lies. And so that if you really want to scientifically study this, you should pick apart the female brain and figure out how it works, and slice it into bits and get all the data there. And this is what
brains are better when they're alive. I think.
Yeah. Well, actually, so much birdsong science is killing the birds, slicing open their brains, looking for the aesthetic sense, and things like that. And recently, some scientists are figuring out how to do it while they're alive, and better ways. Or taking one guy I've worked with, Ofer Chernikovsky, he figured out this ingenious way to record every single sound a baby bird makes when learning to sing over several months. Hundreds of hours of singing data, and then he analyzes them in a computer and figures out how they learn when they forget, and they get to stay alive during this process instead of slicing them up and seeing what happens.
There's just a question up at the back there.
Great, thanks a million. That was great, David. Thanks a million. Have you ever played your clarinet or made music with insects and the insect world?
That's the next book. I'm working on that now. That's the next project.
You were a plant there. That was a plant.
Yeah. A plant, yeah.
Well. So can I ask you, at one point you talk about nature's penchant to evolve beauty, right? Is it not more like our predisposition to find nature beautiful? And, so you give the example of the radiolarians, right, which are these tiny single-celled organisms. There's no sexual selection going on there. They are beautiful. They are beautiful, and Haeckel did so many beautiful drawings of these as well. But there's no audience for that. There is us now, but that's irrelevant, really. We can appreciate it.
Are we confusing, though, we're talking about beauty and art in the same breath, when the two aren't necessarily they're not necessarily the same thing. Art can be extremely ugly and equally have that same point. The effect on it is quite beautiful in terms of what it does objectively, but it in itself isn't necessarily beauty.
Well, the radiolaria story is another part of this idea of beauty and nature. That radiolaria are these tiny, sea creatures, like forms of plankton that just drift. And Ernst Haeckel found them all so beautiful that he collected them all from these expeditions and painted them especially beautifully and symmetrically to show the richness of symmetry and form in nature. And this is the other question that I have in my whole book and project that I raise, that are there not certain basic forms and patterns in nature that we see at many different levels, determined by mathematics, chemistry, and physics, that maybe we find beautiful because we've evolved in the midst of this whole rules of mathematics? And these are some of the things you see selected in those cases of sexual selection. Like, why does the peacock's tail have these kinds of shapes, these kinds of feathers? And what Richard Prum investigated, he demonstrated there's only 9 basic kinds of feathers that can grow because of how mathematics works. And so it's among those possibilities that the selection happens. But you're absolutely right. That kind of beauty is a different question than a species evolving to consider something beautiful that maybe we don't like. Things that we think are kind of ugly, big horns on the heads of creatures that seem excessive, that are selected for often dubious reasons, except that they're just, the females just like it. It's not always females. There are cases where sexual selection goes both ways. But one question I have for you, which I've never got a good answer on, and I was looking for this recently, maybe it's an easy question, that how come in humans it seems like females are more decorated and
it's a complete anomaly. I don't know if there isn't really a good reason, and I think it's a modern phenomenon. So historically, it would have been still the male of the species that it should have shown his worth in some way, maybe in kind of practical ways, but but we're pretty undecorated naturally. We're not like in the both male and female humans, we're pretty plain, right? We're not like a peacock or anything like that, And so, so it's an anomaly, and so I don't have a good answer for you there. It might be a modern construct, like you say, of humans doing things for reasons other than what nature dictates.
Yeah, I mean, most of the literature on it seems to say, in most cultures, the males are still more decorated, and so they don't really help to explain why this might have changed exactly. But I'm sure there is a lot written on this that I just haven't found. There must be.
We just got two more questions. There's one up here. Okay, we'll just take those. Will be the last 4 because we're running out of time. But so yeah.
I was just wondering, as you were saying, we still know so little about the humpback whale and the nightingale and why they make this music. And since you've spent so much time in their habitats, I was just wondering, how hopeful do you feel about the conservation of these species and their future in our world?
Well, there's no question that people were not at all interested in saving whales until they heard this song. That's the defining moment that got people interested in whales. Before that, there was just a handful of conservationists who said, we're just killing all these whales. Most people didn't even know that. It was just going on and on. And, it's because of this song that the whole whale, Save the Whales movement emerged. There's plenty more humpback whales than there were before we stopped killing them in general. There's certainly a few nations still hunting them, but there's so much general human agreement that it's a bad thing, that whales are certainly, they're not saved by any means, but they're much better off than they were before we started paying attention to their aesthetic qualities. And it still goes on, the battle, and we still have the general health of the oceans, which isn't so good. It gets in their way, but there's so much more interest in this because we appreciate this song. So I think it helps to ponder their musicality as we try and make sure that we're not hunting them to extinction. And hardly any, if you ask people all over the world, even in Russia and Japan and Norway, most people still say that we shouldn't be killing whales. Except in Norway, they're very patriotic about whale killing there. Even Iceland is advertising all over whale watching tours, not so much whale killing tours.
Yeah, there was just a question here. Yeah.
Do you not think that maybe where we used to have much more ornamentation, and like ornamentation and functionality can go together? It doesn't have to be one or the other. Because if you look at street lamps, like old Victorian street lamps, the beautiful ornamentation, and now stuff is all much more functional, and even in furniture and that, and maybe we're losing the.
That's a great, insight. Very important. I think that's one of the reasons that, in the rise of functionalism, we didn't want to take sexual selection so seriously, because it seemed nature was full of ornament. There's so much practical beauty we can learn from nature. But I would say that in many areas of both design and society and science and art, that's kind of changed now. Like we appreciate ornamentation again in new and different ways. So I think we're much more open to all these possibilities. That this is the best time yet in history to try and figure this stuff out.
Is it about that balance? The balance between not the kind of Baroque idea of crazy ornamentation everywhere versus the restraining it. You talk about that idea of simplicity at the end. In the book, that it's about what is simple and the simple patterns.
Both things are going on, Now more than ever, we realize that both forces are at work, and that in art and in nature, there's Baroque kinds of species with crazy, birds of paradise ornamentation, and there's sleek, practical, well-designed, insects, minimalist, bald eagles or something like that, or
viruses.
Viruses, viruses.
Although, have you ever seen a picture of a virus down a microscope? They look amazing. They look like little alien spaceships.
Yeah, they're crazy structures.
They're fantastic.
Right.
There was two questions in the middle here, I think, which was just the last one. There's just one there. Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting. I got the same impression that Aoife did, that you think that scientists are quite positivist about it and don't seem to appreciate the beauty that can be in nature. But I think science has evolved as well. And I'd be very interested to see in the music patterns that you found from the nightingales and the whales, what mathematical patterns you could find there. And I think that'd be some lovely kind of research, that if you could team up the art and the science, just like the Science Gallery here, and have mathematicians try and find some patterns in the aesthetics there.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do with these projects. And I have some, whole presentations that this team has come up with full of stuff like that. But the one big question, which might be a good final point, is just how scientists have very different ways of taking evolution, different ways of what they think it explains. You have someone like Richard Dawkins, who thinks natural selection explains everything. It's a total theory. It can be used to explain everything. And then you have other scientists, other people working in evolutionary biology, who will say, it just explains such a small portion of what's going on. It just begins, but there's so much we don't know about, that comes, that this theory, it's a brilliant insight. It's changed the way we understand nature, but it's just, so much of what goes on, it cannot explain it all. And you shouldn't take it as a kind of religion and apply it to everything. You have to know where the limitations are of each approach. And that's why I think you can't blur all these approaches together. Art and science aren't going to be the same. Music, poetry, and biology, they're not all the same when they approach a bird song or an insect song. They all have different kinds of insights, and you have to recognize how they might all fit together without being blurred into one, but kind of work together. And
Well, hopefully we've tried to strive towards that this evening.
yes.
So
Thanks so
with
much.
that, thank you, David and Aoife, as well.
Okay.
Right.
Can I just tell you my favorite quote from the book that I am determined to use out of context and attribute to you each time? In France, they prefer naked people. That is an
That's
entire
good, right?
sentence.
That's right.
In France, they prefer naked people.
That's right. It's in there, yeah.
It's great.
The most
So
popular
thanks.
artwork.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. The best art. Right.
Okay, well, just to remind you as well, David will be signing books outside after the talk. Just here, actually.
Right
so,
here.
So I'm informed. So thank you all very much for coming
Thanks
and
a
having a
lot.
fun time.